TBH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is Brewing with Underwhelming Commanders, sort of a recap, let's say. I've done 40 episodes of my Underwhelming Commanders series now. It is, I think, one of the more important series that I do on my channel. It sort of goes into the whole mentality of my deck building, where I like to push those Underwhelming Commanders, both because it's interesting, but it also increases the diversity in the format. I think that is really important to do. So I am helping you guys out with some of these Underwhelming Commanders and directions to go with them. And I thought that I would go back, look at all the 40 episodes that I have done, and pull out some of my favorite decks, the ones that I just came up with some really interesting builds for, or commanders that I just think are really, really great that you could go in a lot of different directions with, even if you don't do exactly what I did. And for all those viewers out there that are new to my channel, giving you a bit of a refresher here, going back and looking at some of those older decks that I made. I have been doing this series for almost 2 years now. I have the playlist in the description below if you want to check out any of those older videos. But again, I'm just picking out my personal favorites. So we're going to start out with Olivia, Mobilized for War. Did this in episode number 8, 1 black and a red vampire knight 3/3 with flying. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may discard a card. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. It gains haste until end of turn, and it becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. So I'm mentioning this one first because I did make a really interesting deck, I think, but Olivia is a very unpopular commander in the format with so many different directions you can go with it. That's what I discovered when I started building this deck. First of all, your commander is a vampire and a knight, so you can do any vampire or knight tribal stuff here. Also, obviously, you're turning your creatures into vampires, which helps with that vampire tribal theme. You're also giving your creatures haste, which is something that you can build around. You're also putting +1/+1 counters on your creatures, which is something that you can build around. And of course, you're also in a discard theme because your commander is sort of a discard outlet, and there is lots and lots of really great support in black and red colors for discard. In fact, there's a whole bunch more that came out after I made this deck. So in addition to the stuff that I already had in there, I think this is a really great commander all around. And then on top of that, a really interesting deck that I threw together where I sort of worked in as many of the different themes here that I could. Next up, we have my Treva the Renewer deck. This was from episode 20, 3 blue, green, and a white dragon 6/6 with flying. When Trevor the Renewer deals combat damage to a player, you may pay 2 and a white. If you do, choose a color, then you gain 1 life for each permanent of that color. So I came up with a really interesting idea. It's one that I've sort of done before in the past. I have a Dragon Lord Jamoka deck that is sort of similar, and I did a similar theme here, but of course I get the blue as well, which is pretty significant. One of the things with this cycle of dragons, there's a whole cycle here that cares about the color of stuff. If you can turn everything into that certain color, it makes it a lot better for you, obviously. So Painter's Servant being the most important card. And when I built this deck, I decided on one color that I want to turn everything into, and that color was black. Black also is a very popular color in the format already. So even if without your Painter's Servant, you can get a lot of work done here with a lot of the cards in this deck, like Life Force, for example. Green and a green, counter target black spell, right? That's pretty good. Pygmy Kavu, another favorite of mine that I have in my Dragon Lord Jamoka deck. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each black creature your opponents control. So that's already a decent card if you don't have your Painter's Servant. But if you do have your Painter's Servant, you're drawing a card for every single creature your opponents control. Pretty fantastic. And we also, because we're in blue here, have a backup card, which is Shifting Sky. 2 and a blue enchantment. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. And of course, you're going to choose black here. And all non-land permanents are the chosen color. Not quite as good as Painter's Servant, but is going to work pretty good. So basically, the theme of this deck is we want to turn our opponent's stuff into black cards or black creatures or black permanents and then gain advantage off of it. And of course, we can use our commander's ability as well, where when we connect, if we have our Painter's Servant out, we're going to gain 1 life for each permanent that is black, because of course we're choosing black, and that's going to be every single permanent on the battlefield. So on top of all the other cards in the deck that are working in that theme, we can just gain like 40 or 50 life off of our commander's ability as well. Pretty interesting deck. Next up, Moloku the Clouded Mirror from episode 22. 4 and a blue, Moonfolk Wizard 2/4 with flying. Pay 1, return a land you control to its owner's hand, create a 1/1 blue illusion creature token with flying. And again, this is another commander that I'm kind of shocked it's not more popular. It is so interesting and unique in what it's doing. It really does have a powerful ability, but again, is doing a lot of different things. Your commander's a Moonfolk and a Wizard. That's something that you can go after, even though I didn't particularly do that in this deck. The ability here, there is so much you can do with, and I try to do, again, as much as I could here. You're returning lands to your hand. That's obviously something that you can work with. You're just returning stuff to your hand, which is good. So a card like Baron works really good here, where it wants you to be returning stuff to your hand. You're creating illusion tokens, so you can do the illusion tribal thing. There are also flying creatures that you're making, so you can do the flying tribal thing here as well. And there's just a lot of neat interactions that I threw in this deck that deals with either returning the lands to your hand or creating the tokens or whatever. Really great commander here, and a really interesting deck I threw together. Next up, Masako the Humorless from episode 23. 2 and a white, human advisor 2/1. Has flash, and tapped creatures you control can block as though they were untapped. And again, doesn't look like much, but I really like the deck I threw together here. First of all, our commander has flash, so I thought, why not throw a bunch of other flash creatures in there? So I did a little bit of a flash tribal theme. Being able to play on your opponent's turns all the time is really a huge advantage in a commander game. Flashing in your creatures means that you're always going to have blockers. It makes it a lot easier to avoid board wipes, and it also sort of is pseudo haste, because of course on your turn your creatures can attack right away. But more so, I went with a tapping theme here, right? Because our creatures can block even if they're tapped, means that we can tap our creatures down to do a bunch of other things, right? So I went with a mono white tap theme, put a lot of really interesting cards in this deck that are tapping down our own creatures, and then if we get attacked, we can still block with our creatures, of course, because we can block with our creatures if they're tapped. Pretty interesting deck. Next up, we got Diochan Artful Beauty from episode 24. 3 and a red, human advisor 1/1. Tap, destroy target creature of your choice. Then destroy target creature of an opponent's choice. Activate only during your turn before attackers are declared. This is just such an interesting commander, and really an interesting card in a commander game, period. You could just throw this in any deck, and it is a really neat removal option, but also a politics card, because obviously you can choose the opponent who is also going to want to remove the same things that you want to remove, right? You got one guy who's way ahead on the board. You choose a creature of theirs to destroy, and then you choose another opponent who's going to want to follow suit. So you're getting two of that player's creatures off the board with a one shot. Pretty darn good. But how did I build this deck? Well, of course, the downside of Diochan is that your opponents can choose your commander as their choice, and then your commander gets destroyed, but they can't do so if A, your commander is indestructible, because then of course it can't get destroyed. So I did a whole lot of that in the deck, and I also did protection from red, which also works with this ability. If your commander has some effect that gives it protection from red, it cannot be targeted by a red ability, and your commander obviously is red and is targeting, so it makes it immune to its own ability. So I made it so that your opponents can't be choosing your commander as their target. And then of course I built around that. I put lots of other indestructible creatures in the deck so they can't be destroyed. I put stuff in the deck that can't be targeted. Again, the protection from red thing here works really good. Basically, I built the deck so that no matter what my opponent's choice is, I'm probably going to be pretty okay with it. Really interesting deck, and just a really interesting commander all around in the format. Next up, Taigum Sidisi's Hand from episode 27. 3 blue and a black, human wizard 3/4. Skip your draw step. That's not great. However, at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. And you can also pay black and tap, exile X cards from your graveyard. Target creature gets -X until end of turn. Another commander that I'm shocked how unpopular it is. Again, I don't think this is necessarily an underwhelming commander. It's just a really unpopular one. And there's a lot of neat things that you can do with it. And what I decided to do with this deck is use an idea from one of my 10 10 deck ideas videos that I thought fit nicely with Taigum, which is we want a whole bunch of stuff in our graveyard, which of course our commander is helping us do, but we don't want anything in our opponent's graveyards. There's a lot of cards out there that are going to love the idea of our opponents having empty graveyards and us having a full graveyard. So the deck is entirely built around that strategy. We want lots of stuff in our graveyards and we want our opponent's graveyards to be empty. So it's a bunch of cards that are taking advantage of that, and obviously a bunch of cards that are assisting us with the strategy of doing that, like Leyline of the Void, for example, which is going to make sure our opponent's graveyards are exiled, but ours are still full. Really, really interesting deck with some really unique cards in here. Really love this one. Next up, we got Iname Death Aspect from episode 34. 4 black, Spirit 4/4. When Iname Death Aspect enters the battlefield, you may search your library for any number of spirit cards and put them into your graveyard, then shuffle. So again, I took one of my 10 deck ideas to use with this commander. When it won the poll, I thought, well, I already had talked about this in one of my 10 deck ideas videos. Why not go after that? And I ended up doing it. It really is probably one of the more powerful decks I've ever made on my Underwhelming Commanders videos. I threw a whole bunch of really interesting combos in here. First of all, you could just throw a Mortal Combat down at the beginning of your upkeep. If you have 20 more creature cards in your graveyard, you win the game. That seems like a pretty good fit. We can just use a Patriarch's Bidding to return all those spirits from our graveyard directly into play. We can just reanimate our Revenant from our graveyard, right? That is a spirit, so we can chuck it in our graveyard with all our other spirits, return it to play, and now we have a flyer that has power and toughness equal to the number of creature cards in our graveyard, so we can start one-shotting our opponents with that. But then we can also just throw down a Maskwood Nexus and turn all the creature cards in our entire library into spirits and put whatever we want into our graveyard. So we can throw like a Mikius and a Triskelion combo in our graveyard and reanimate that. Of course, the Patriarch's Bidding is going to now hit all the creatures in our graveyard if we have the Maskwood Nexus in play. There's a whole lot of really interesting combos that I ended up throwing in this deck. You got to check out the actual video to find out all the different things I did. Again, probably one of the more powerful decks I made on my Underwhelming Commanders series. Very combo heavy. Next up, Rasputin Dreamweaver from episode 36. 4 white and a blue human wizard 4/1. It enters the battlefield with 7 dream counters on it. Remove a dream counter, add a colorless mana, or you can remove a dream counter to prevent the next one damage that would be dealt to Rasputin. Don't think we'll be ever doing that because we want to be doing that first ability with the mana. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if Rasputin started the turn untapped, put a dream counter on it. And it can't have more than 7 dream counters on it. And again, another commander where it doesn't maybe look like much, but there is a lot you can do with it. And I did a lot of interesting things here. First of all, I did mostly a blink strategy because of course our commander enters the battlefield with those counters on it. Your commander comes into play, you can immediately remove all 7 counters from it to cast, say, a Meteor Golem, and then on your end step, you blink it with your Conjurer's Closet. It comes back into play with 7 dream counters on it again. In fact, you can play your commander and then immediately remove 5 counters to cast your Conjurer's Closet, which then will trigger on your end step. I tried to, as much as I could, put cards in this deck that I could immediately use that 7 colorless mana off my commander, like a Thundersteel Colossus, for example, right? I cast my commander, I immediately remove 7 counters from it, play it, it has Trample and Haste and is a 7/7 and crew 2, and of course I can immediately crew it with my commander so I can attack with it right away. Chromatic Ori is a phenomenal fit here, right? That's the 7 colorless mana that we have, but more importantly, we may spend mana as though we're mana of any color, so that means the colorless mana that we are now using from our commander now becomes mana of any color, and of course our Chromatic Ori also is going to tap to add 5 colorless mana or mana of any color, so we can immediately use that right away once we put it in play. Gotta protect our commander, and I thought Not of This World was an absolutely phenomenal fit here. This is a card that doesn't see enough play in the format, I don't think. 7 mana, tribal instant Eldrazi, counter target spell or ability that targets a permanent you control, so a great way to protect our commander once it hits the battlefield, because it does cost 6. We don't want it getting removed right away. Not of This World costs 7 less to cast if it targets a spell or ability that targets a creature you control with power 7 or greater, so that's why I think this is a fantastic fit in a lot of decks where you have a commander with power 7 or greater. Of course, in this deck, that's not the case. In this deck, we will actually be paying the 7 mana because, of course, our commander gives us 7 colorless mana. So we can immediately play our commander if we have this in our hand and just leave the counters on there in case one of our opponents tries to kill our commander before we get around to our next turn. A lot of really interesting interactions I have here with this commander. This is one that I actually had considered building myself because I just loved some of the neat cards that I had put in here that you really don't see that much anywhere else. Again, a commander that I guess is kind of underwhelming, but more so it's just really unpopular. And I will end with a couple of decks that were from a video that I did where I just threw out a whole bunch of decks. You know, I make so many decks in my free time, even when I'm not doing them for my channel, that I sort of accumulate a whole bunch. So I did an episode where I just threw out 12 decks that I had made that weren't necessarily for my Underwhelming Commanders series, but they were for the most part Underwhelming Commanders. And in some cases, they were Underwhelming Commanders that I had featured on my series, but I didn't actually go and make the entire deck. And I ended up, again, just finishing it on my own and seeing how it would play out because I liked the ideas I came up with. Hua Tuo, Honored Physician, was one of them. 1 green, human, 1/2. Tap, put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. Activate only during your turn before attackers are declared. Again, another commander that this ability doesn't look like much. It's kind of like, okay, put creature on top of your library, big deal. But once you start digging, and of course that's what I did a whole lot of digging, finding all these really neat interactions we could have, whole bunch of interesting cards in green that would love to have a creature on top of your library. I even have a really awesome combo in here with Verdant Succession, 4 and a green enchantment. Whenever a green non-token creature dies, that creature's controller may search their library for a card with the same name as that creature and put it onto the battlefield. This works so great with Hua Tuo because, of course, as long as you do this before your attackers are declared, you can sacrifice that creature. It's going to go to your graveyard, and then you can respond by putting it on top of your library with your commander. So then, of course, when you search your library for it, it's on top, so it's going to go directly back into play. Really neat card in that deck. Just a really neat commander all around, I think. But I'm going to end off with Morrite of the Frost, again from that particular episode. In fact, I've done this guy on a couple of episodes. There's very few commanders, I think, that I have talked about more on my channel than this guy because I just think he's so good, so interesting. There's a lot of different directions you can go with him, and I can't believe how unpopular he is in the format. 2 green, blue, legendary snow creature shapeshifter. It's an 0/0 and it has Changeling. You may have Morrite of the Frost enter the battlefield as a copy of a permanent you control, except it's legendary and snow in addition to its other types. And if it's a creature, it enters with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on it and has Changeling. So again, there's a lot you can do here. You have a commander that has Changeling that will copy a creature and still have Changeling. You're putting the counters on there, so you can do that as well. You can do a combo with like Woodfall Primus or any of those persist creatures. It's also snow, so you can do the snow theme here as well. But what I decided to do with this commander was very unique because I thought, well, you know what? I think everyone is just going to go after the copying creature thing, but your commander can copy any permanent you control. Why don't we copy a land? Now, why would you want to do that? Well, there are a few reasons. First of all, if your commander is a land, it's a lot harder to get it off the table, right? Land destruction is way less popular than obviously creature destruction in the format. Your commander is going to escape any board wipes. But I also found a lot of cards that are fitting the land creature theme, but also snow land creature theme as well. So the idea of the deck, very fringe, crazy, weird idea, but I think it's an interesting one, is I copy a land, and in particular, one of those lands that is either hexproof or indestructible, so that even if our opponent does have land removal or instant speed, of course, creature removal will work as well. We're going to be protected from that. And then we use the effects that turn lands into creatures. Or again, there's a couple of effects out there that are turning snow lands into creatures, which of course our commander will be, and then we can attack our opponents with. So it is essentially a Voltron strategy where I have my commander, it is an indestructible land. Let's say, for example, I pile some counters on it, I swing with it, I get in for damage, and then everyone keeps casting board wipes, killing all the other creatures, and my commander keeps surviving. It is a very interesting fringe idea. I know it's not the easiest deck in the world to play, that's for sure, but it is certainly one of the most interesting ones that I have done on this series. So feel free to check it out, or any of the decks that I mentioned here. These are all my personal favorites from the 40 episodes I've done on my Underwhelming Commander series. The deck lists for all of them are in the description below. Feel free to give them a go yourself. Stay tuned for the next Underwhelming Commanders videos, which will return to form. Episode 41, of course. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.